There are some mornings that seem completely ordinary, and yet somehow I can never forget them for the rest of my life. I still remember that day vividly, a summer morning in the year 1969. The sun had not risen high yet, but its pale light had already slipped through the leaves, casting soft shadows onto the wooden porch in front of our house. I was just 12 years old, then standing next to Tom, my older brother, and Billy, our little tag-along brother who always trailed behind. The three of us stood there, barefoot on the damp wood, still clinging to the night's dew eyes, following the olive-green pickup truck slowly backing out of the driveway. Dad was behind the wheel. His arm reached out the window, brushing dust off the side mirror. The truck rumbled a bit, then rolled away. None of us said a word. No goodbye, no drive safe, not even a wave. There was only the sound of the tires crunching on gravel and a thin cloud of dust rising in the early morning light. And yet somehow, I remember every single detail as if it were just yesterday. Maybe it is because that moment told me more than any words my father had ever spoken. Maybe it is because that was the first time I understood that love sometimes shows itself in silence. Here I sit now, more than half a century later, on that same old wooden chair. My back is more hunched, my hands more unsteady, but the memories come back as clearly as ever. Every time the morning light shines through this porch, the same way I find myself watching something disappear into the distance, and in my heart I am still that boy Jack, standing beside his two brothers, watching his father's silhouette fade away without saying a word. If there is a morning you can never forget, tell us about it in the comments below, because maybe someone else once stood in silence the same way you did. And if you see a piece of yourself in this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button, so every week we can open another little window back to childhood together. The summer of 1969. People say it was the summer that changed the world. For the first time in history, humans set foot on the moon. All across America, the excitement was electric. Millions of people glued their eyes to black and white TV screens, listening intently to every word beamed back from outer space. But in the small town where I grew up, no one really chased after that grand event. At least not us kids. To me, the moon was just something that hung quietly in the night sky, round and pale, like the cookies my mother used to bake. None of my friends believed you could actually go there. It was far too cold, and honestly not nearly as exciting as chasing water snakes in the creek at the end of our street. My world back then was tiny. It revolved around our faded beige house, the dusty red dirt road out front, and those quiet mornings when I sat on the old wooden steps watching my dad drive off to work. Our town was not big. Every morning I could hear the sound of lawnmowers from nearby yards, the clatter of soda cans kicked around by kids playing behind the houses, and sometimes the soft chime of wind bells dancing in the early breeze. Grown-ups got up early, not to hear world news, but to make coffee, haul water to their gardens, or patch up their kids' torn clothes from the day before. Life was not noisy, it just drifted by, gently like a slow spinning film reel. My mornings began with the smell of coffee, wafting from the kitchen, the sound of my mother flipping through the newspaper, and the heavy footsteps of my father coming down the wooden stairs. I still remember that sound, steady and deep, like the heartbeat of our whole house. My mother, Maggie, was always the first one awake. She wore a thin cotton blouse with tiny flower prints, her hair tied neatly at the back of her neck. Her hands moved quickly, sweeping the floor, then preparing breakfast. On the table there would be toast with slightly burnt edges and a jar of peach jam she made herself. Right beside that was the wooden radio, the one that crackled every morning. Sometimes it played the news. Sometimes it was a loud male voice reporting how Apollo was about to land on the moon. My father was different. He was not a man of many words. He would sit at the head of the table holding a cup of coffee, his eyes looking out the window, toward the strip of sunlight stretching across the wooden floor. Sometimes he would nod when Mom handed him toast or lightly touch her hand. A silent thank you. To me back then, nothing in the world felt bigger than the image of my father sitting quietly like that. Not the moon, not rockets. Just that quiet man who woke up early every day, wore the same pale blue shirt, and always adjusted the collar before walking out the door. Those mornings, the golden sunlight would filter through the curtains and dust would float in the air like snow. Billy would still be asleep. Tom was already out in the yard pushing his bike, and I would sit on the porch steps, chin resting on my knees, watching my dad step outside and gently close the door, as if not to disturb the calm of the house. Back then, life in our little town moved at the pace of a soft breeze. No one was ever in a rush, and everyone knew each other's name, or at the very least their face. The corner grocery store still had a hand-painted wooden open sign that swung gently in the wind. An old man, George, who lived next door, would come outside every afternoon like clockwork, never to actually shovel anything, but to lean on it, talk about the weather, and nod at every car that passed. Some days were so hot the asphalt would soften underfoot and your sandals stuck to the pavement with every step, as if the road itself wanted you to slow down. But there were also those magical, cool nights when Billy and I would climb up onto the roof of the garage, lie on our backs, point at the stars, and make up wild stories about UFOs, secret planets, and space explorers who looked just like us. And yet all of those details, all the moments I hold in my memory scattered like photographs in a dusty shoebox, seem to fold back into a single quiet ritual every morning without fail when Dad drove off to work. The old olive green Chevrolet would sputter once or twice, coughing awake like it had to remember how to move, then slowly roll out of the gravel driveway. Dad would be behind the wheel, his left hand gripping the steering wheel, his right elbow resting casually on the doorframe, eyes steady and focused on the road ahead. Each time he shifted gears, the entire truck gave a slight jolt, not enough to cause worry, but just enough to wake you up, to remind you that this too was part of the rhythm of the day, that everything, despite the rust, the creaks, the changes, was still where it should be. That in many ways was how I told time as a child, not by a ticking clock or a wristwatch, but by the sound of that engine roaring to life each morning, by the sight of the truck disappearing slowly behind the line of trees at the edge of our property, by the feel of standing on the porch barefoot with Tom and Billy watching, not saying a word, just watching. The silence was never uncomfortable. It was full of knowing, full of something we didn't yet have words for. I never truly understood why we kept doing that, why we stood there morning after morning, always in the same spot, always in the same stillness. Maybe it was just habit. Maybe it was because Mom always woke early and the kitchen was already filled with the smell of butter on toast or the rich aroma of coffee in the percolator, and that comfort made us all want to rise with the sun. Or maybe, just maybe, some quiet part of us already knew that what we were witnessing mattered, that the sight of Dad driving away wasn't just part of the morning routine, it was a kind of ceremony, a signal that the day had officially begun, a silent goodbye wrapped in consistency. A small, steady anchor dropped into the ever-changing waters of our childhood world. Those mornings repeated like they had been carefully choreographed. And in the middle of all that quiet, one thing never changed: my father's steady, perfectly timed footsteps. My father was not someone who liked to talk. He was not the type to show his emotions easily. I'd never seen him cry. I'd never heard him say anything poetic. But if there was one thing that made me feel safe as a kid, it was that he was always on time. As if even time itself followed his footsteps every morning. Our house each morning felt like a silent play, and Dad was the lead actor walking on stage at the exact same moment every single day. No alarm clock, no one needed to call him. At exactly 5:30 in the morning, he would open the bedroom door. The hinges would creak softly. Then his footsteps would land lightly on the wooden stairs, followed by the soft clicking of the bathroom faucet. I lay in bed listening to those same sounds over and over through my childhood, each one like a part of a background song that never changed. Dad always wore dark blue jeans and a long-sleeve button-up shirt. In the summer, he would roll the sleeves up to his elbows. In the winter, he buttoned it to the top and added a thick coat. His leather belt was worn down almost completely on the inside. Every morning, he would stand in front of the little mirror on the wall, fastening each button with his calloused fingers, then threading his belt through the loops in one slow, firm motion. Like a ritual, I remember once asking him why not buy a new one. He just shook his head and said, "This one's not broken." His boots sat right under the wooden bench by the back door. Thick-soled, heavy brown boots with a paint stain still stuck on the edge of the left sole. Every time he put them on, he would bend one knee, brace it with one hand, and tighten the laces so firmly that you could hear them pulling through each eyelet. And without fail, once they were on, he would pat both pant legs, stand up, glance out the window, like checking the weather with his own eyes, then turn to grab the cup of coffee Mom had left on the table. I watched him do those things 1,000 times. From when I had to stand on tiptoe just to see the tabletop to when I could sit comfortably and still be nearly his height. Not once did he miss a step. Not a single morning was he ever late. Whether it rained, snowed, or stormed, he still woke up on time, ate on time, and left the house on time. What amazed me was that Dad never seemed rushed, yet he was never late. It was as if he had calculated down to the second how much time he needed to get ready to move from one room to the next, from the house to the car, from the car to work. One time the engine would not start because it was too cold. He just opened the trunk, grabbed an old rag, wiped something under the hood, and within 3 minutes the car started again. No swearing, no complaining, just quiet, calm motion, like he had planned for it all along. My father never wore a wristwatch. He did not trust the radio reports either, but no one in our house ever doubted his timing. Every time Mom asked what time it was, he would glance out the window, look at the way the light hit the wall, and say something like, about 10 to 6. And every time he was right. His world ran on some internal clock, one that did not have hands but ran on discipline, routine, and a deep sense of duty. And I believe that very consistency was what kept our family grounded even during the hardest, most uncertain years. I do not remember my father ever hugging me. There were no head pats, no "I love you, son." But I remember the sound of the leather belt tightening the coffee pouring into a tin cup, and the soft nod he gave when he opened the door to leave. All those little things, over time, became my father's own language. A language with no words, but one I always understood. There was one time I tried to copy him. I woke up early, put on a button-down shirt, fastened my belt made of fabric, and walked barefoot down the stairs. I tried to do everything slowly, just like he did. But when I got to the door, I stopped. I realized I could copy every single move, but I could never bring the same sense of certainty he did. Because that sense of comfort he gave did not come from the belt or the boots or the timing. It came from who he was. It was only when I got older that I understood some people do not need to say "I will always be here" because they never left. They show up through consistency, through repeating the smallest things each day, like how the sun always rises in the east. And my father, in his quiet way, taught me that sometimes love does not need to be loud or named. It just needs to show up on time every morning. Every step my father took toward the door, every time he tightened his shoelaces, always led to the most familiar sound, the sputter of the engine signaling that he was about to leave our little world behind. And then, like a scene from a film played on a slow, endless loop, I would watch that olive green Chevrolet slowly roll down the driveway, leaving behind a thin veil of dust suspended in the early sunlight like a wordless goodbye. That truck was never the kind of vehicle people bragged about. It was not the type of pickup that turned heads or made people whistle in admiration when it passed by. In fact, even during its best years, back when it still had a bit of shine left and the engine ran smoother, it was never considered fancy or luxurious or even desirable. It was just an old pickup truck with faded olive green paint that had long lost its gloss, a body marked with small dents and scratches from years of use, and back tires that let out a familiar creak every single time it turned a corner. But to our family, that truck meant more than looks or reputation. It was part of who we were. It represented quiet strength, dependable presence, and quiet resilience. It was a constant companion that never complained, never demanded attention, and never left us behind, even as the years wore it down and time dragged streaks of rust like battle scars across its aging frame. It stood through storms, through blazing summers and freezing winters, always parked in the same spot, ready each morning. It might not have been worth much to anyone else but to us. That truck carried memories, held our childhoods, and stood as a symbol of something unshakable in a world that never stopped moving. My father took care of that truck, not by polishing or washing it every weekend, but by knowing it. He never said he loved it, but he knew every rattle in its engine. He could tell when the spark plugs were weak, when the brakes felt soft, and he always had a torn rag and an old bottle of oil tucked away in the back. Whenever the truck had a problem, he never cursed or got angry. He would simply lift the hood, rest his arm on the fender, sigh quietly, and start repairing it like an old craftsman carefully stitching back together a worn-out memory. I remember clearly one morning when the truck would not start, and it happened to be the day Dad needed to be at the plant earlier than usual. Mom peeked out the window, worried. But Dad calmly said it's all right, then turned and called out, "Jack, bring me the screwdriver from the wooden box." I ran off right away. He did not yell. He was not in a rush. And just a few minutes later, the engine turned over again, like he had whispered something only the truck could understand. Watching him that day, I thought maybe the truck just could not bring itself to disappoint a man like him. To the three of us boys, that truck was not just Dad's, it was part of our childhood. On cold winter mornings, we would fight over the warmest spot on the back seat when he drove us into town. On summer afternoons, I would sit behind the wheel pretending to be a cross-country driver listening to the old radio crackle out country music. Once I secretly stuffed a few plastic bugs into the glove box to scare Tom. He screamed so loud that, for the first time in my life, Dad burst out laughing. But the memory that sticks with me most is the first time I sat in the front seat. It was a foggy morning. Dad had to run an errand and said, "Hop in, you're coming with me." I climbed in quickly, sat up straight, both hands resting on my knees like I was headed into an important meeting. Sitting beside him felt different, closer, clearer. I could see how he gripped the steering wheel, how he checked the mirrors, how he adjusted the radio. I did not ask any questions. I did not say a word. But in that cramped little cabin, filled with the scent of old leather, a faint trace of tobacco, and the low hum of the engine, I felt the closest to him I had ever been. Then one day Dad asked, "Want to give it a try?" I looked at him wide-eyed, thinking he was joking. But he was serious. He drove us to the open lot behind the factory, stepped out, and let me slide behind the wheel. He taught me how to shift gears, press the gas pedal, and adjust the mirrors. The first time I turned the steering wheel, my hands trembled like the whole truck might split in two. But Dad never interrupted, never criticized. He just sat there steady and quiet like the very truck he trusted. I made it through about 3 laps before I hit the brakes too hard and jolted both of us forward. He ruffled my hair and said, "Not bad." Later in life, I would come to understand that was his way of teaching. No yelling, no grand lectures. Just trust quietly placed in the hands of his son and letting the truck do the rest. Every mark on that Chevrolet held a piece of our story. The scratch on the door from when Billy crashed his bike. The dent in the back seat where Mom once sat cradling a basket of eggs from the market. There were winters so cold Dad had to dig out a path for the truck to reach the main road. There were trips to the lake where the sound of the engine blended with our laughter. And there were weary afternoons when Dad would sit in the truck for a few minutes after coming home, like he needed a moment alone to shift from work mode back into the rhythm of home. The older I got, the more I realized each time the truck drove off, it took a little more of my childhood with it. It left every morning with a piece of memory, a sliver of time. And each evening when it returned coated in dust, I knew another day had passed and another moment had been tucked away inside that dented metal shell. That old Chevrolet, though it eventually came to a stop, still lives on in my memory. No matter how many new cars came along, no matter how advanced technology became, nothing ever replaced the sound of that morning sputter or the image of my father's silhouette behind the wheel, slowly growing smaller in the distance. And if you ask me what object held the most of my vanished years, I would answer without hesitation. That old pickup truck, the vessel of quiet love, of a father's unwavering patience, and of an engine's hum fading into the distance like a gentle reminder that time never waits. And as that old truck slowly disappeared behind the trees, carrying my father, and the most familiar part of every morning, with it, another world was awakening behind that white-painted wooden door, the world of my mother, and of the kitchen that was always warm with fire. That kitchen was not large. A simple rectangular wooden table, 4 mismatched chairs, and a tiny window that opened to the backyard where purple flowers bloomed, the kind my mother had planted so long ago. No one could quite remember when. But that room every morning was the heart of our home, the place where every flavor, every sound, and every feeling of peace began. My mother always woke up before the sunlight slipped through the curtains. I never knew how much she actually slept. I just knew that when I opened my eyes, the kitchen light was already glowing yellow, and the air already carried something warm and familiar, sometimes the rich smell of coffee, sometimes butter melting on toast, and sometimes just the soft warmth of milk warming on the stove. No one told her to wake up early. No one asked her to. She just did, as if it were a habit woven from love and quiet strength. What I remember most was the sound of the radio. Every morning it was the first thing she turned on before she even lit the stove. It was an old wooden radio, dark brown, its tuning knob chipped from years of use. She always turned the dial with care, like someone knocking gently on the door of another world. Sometimes it was the morning news with a steady male voice. Sometimes a woman's voice reading the weather. And sometimes cheerful ads came on. Start your day right with Maxwell House Coffee. But the best moments were when classical music played. My mother never said she liked it. But whenever it came on, her hands moved more gently as she stirred the batter, and her feet swayed ever so slightly as she stood by the sink. She would hum along to a few notes, not quite singing, like the music had lived in her for so long that words were no longer needed to understand it. As for me, I always woke up earlier than Tom and Billy just so I could sit in that old wooden chair beside the table and watch my mother prepare breakfast. Not because I was hungry, but because I loved the way she poured milk without spilling a drop, how she sliced bread with the old knife and made every piece even, and how she smoothed out the tablecloth just to fix a tiny crease. Once I asked her, "Why do you always turn on the radio in the morning?" She did not turn around. She simply said, "So I know what day it is, and to remind myself I'm still living in this world." That answer took me years to understand, because when you live inside the same routines every day, it is only the familiar sounds that keep you from losing yourself. Breakfast in our kitchen was never fancy. A slice of toast, a fried egg, sometimes a small jar of homemade peach jam, a glass of milk for Billy and me, coffee for Dad. Mom usually just drank water, sometimes finishing the half of Billy's toast he left behind. But she always sat down with us. She never let anyone eat alone. There were freezing mornings when she would turn on the oven early just to warm the kitchen. When the light from the window met the oven's rising heat, a thin mist would rise like fog, and in that soft haze stood my mother, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled high, patching Tom's shirt, while listening to the radio announce gas prices had gone up a few more cents. Everything, the steam, the heat, the voices from the radio blended into a kind of memory that no matter how many years pass, I still remember clearly. And I remember the rainy mornings too. When raindrops tapped on the metal roof, she would quietly say, "Wear your thick coat today. Do not get your feet wet." Then she would wipe Dad's shoes dry by hand, the ones he had left by the door. And if Billy was still asleep, she would pour milk into his cup, place it gently on the table, and then walk upstairs, open his door quietly, rub his back, and whisper just loud enough to wake him. "Time to get up, sweetheart. Morning's here." That morning's silence never left me. It lingered like a quiet shadow and followed me through the years, quietly echoing in every moment I found myself standing at train stations, at airports, or at the edge of bus platforms. Those places where people part ways without saying too much, where words feel unnecessary and even small. It lived in the hush before the announcement of a delayed train, in the soft rumble of luggage wheels, in the unspoken glances of those who were leaving and those who stayed. It was there in my eyes when I looked at my wife as she gave birth, a silence filled not with absence but with awe, gratitude, and 1,000 words I could not speak. It was there again years later when I looked at my 2 sons during their teenage storms, not judging, not lecturing, just looking quietly, hoping that in my stillness they would feel the same message I once felt. Dad is here. I am here. I realized as time went on that some moments need no words at all, because once the heart has fully grasped the truth of a moment, once it has reached the deepest part of what it means, it no longer needs language to preserve it. It simply stays there steady and quiet, like an invisible thread, weaving itself through your life, stitching every memory together and making it whole. You do not hold it. It holds you. And now as I sit here retelling it all as a 68-year-old man with hands spotted and lined from time my fingers, carrying both strength and trembling, I can still see it so clearly. Like a film reel running in slow motion, 3 boys standing on the front porch, the boards cool under our bare feet, Tom shielding his eyes from the harsh sun with his palm, Billy clutching his favorite toy so tightly, as if it might slip away, and me standing in the middle, not speaking, but full of things I wanted to say. None of us spoke a single word, yet somehow all of us seemed to whisper the same thing in our hearts. Dad, I see you, and I will remember, always, every time you leave. Always, even if you do not hear me. Those quiet mornings were just a small part of my father's life. A life where he rarely spoke out loud, where his footsteps carried more meaning than his words. Yet he was always there silently, holding everything together for all of us with a steadiness that shaped our days. He was the unseen rhythm behind the mornings, the anchor none of us had to question. Inside the house, he never raised his voice. He did not yell, did not scold with harsh words, and he certainly never said things like, "I do this because I love you." But it was exactly those things he left unsaid, those gaps, where words might have been, that we remembered the most. And what made him a hero in my memories was not any grand gesture, not a medal, not a speech, but the little details, the kind most people overlook, the small rituals, repeated until they became part of the house itself. I still remember a rainy October afternoon, as if it were a photograph burned into my mind. It had been pouring since morning, a relentless gray rain that blurred the world beyond the window. The back roof was leaking water, dripping right onto Billy's bed, soaking the blanket he had dragged from the couch. Mom said we could fix it the next day when the rain stopped, when it was easier. But Dad quietly set down his bowl of rice, pulled on his old coat with the worn elbows, grabbed the wooden ladder, and went out behind the house. He said nothing. Took no one with him, just a hammer, a few sheets of tin, and the flashlight Mom handed him without a word, their eyes meeting for a moment of understanding. I stood by the window, peering through the misty rain. The sky had gone dark, the yard a blur of mud and water. Dad was crouched on the roof, his shadow barely visible against the gray sky, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. Each strike of the hammer rang out, steady and clear, cutting through the sound of rain like a heartbeat. And with every blow I felt reassured that no matter how hard it stormed outside, no matter how uncertain the world felt, someone inside was holding the roof over our heads. Someone was making sure we were safe. Someone was there. Things like that happened so often they became routine. A clogged pipe, the washing machine rattling the fridge, not staying cold whenever something broke. Dad would never complain, never call a repairman. He would just quietly go check it out. Sleeves rolled high, glasses slipping down his nose, muttering softly to himself, like he was having a familiar conversation with old friends. I remember one winter so cold, the water pipe to the backyard froze solid. Tom had the flu, I had a sore throat, and Billy slept through the whole afternoon. It was just Mom simmering a pot of chicken soup, and Dad sitting by the door wrapping a towel around the water heater, eyes narrowed in quiet focus. I asked, "Why not just buy a new one?" He answered, "If this one still works, we don't need to replace it yet." It was never about money. It was because he believed that anything that had been with us for a long time deserved to be kept, to be cared for, just like he cared for this home for Mom, for each of us. Dad was always the last to eat dinner. Always. Every meal. Mom would set the food on the table and call us in first. Dad would still be tinkering with something, the window that squeaked, the charcoal stove Mom said was too smoky, and only after he checked everything would he sit down. By then there was usually just one piece of meat left or the crusty edges we did not want. But Dad ate with joy, no complaints. He never asked why no one saved him more. He just ate. And if Mom was tired, he would quietly get up and do the dishes. My memory is full of the nights he came home from late shifts. Mud on his boots, oil on his coat, his face worn from a full day hauling at the factory, but he always entered the house with a soft click of the door, took off his shoes. By the steps hung up his coat properly. No grumbling. No groaning, just silence, checking to see who was asleep, whether the lights were off, and only then heading to the bathroom to clean up. I'd seen cracks on Dad's hands, cracks that bled in winter. His skin was dry, rough, and calloused. When he patted my head, I could feel the years carved into those palms. Once I asked Mom why he did not use hand cream. She smiled and said, "Working hands, son. He says lotion makes things too slippery, can't grip what he's holding." And truly, Dad never needed soft hands. He only needed hands strong enough to hold up the roof, push the old truck every morning, and carry the cup of coffee Mom made for him while it was still dark out. Dad's love was never in the words, "I love you, son." It was in the way he woke up earlier than usual to take me to school on my first day. In the note he left quietly on the table, "Jack, don't forget your jacket when the weather turned cold." It was in the way he gave Billy the softer pillow during the long ride to visit Grandma, in how he sliced the apple in half and always put the sweeter side on my plate, in the way he looked at me every time I caught him watching from the rearview mirror, eyes filled with quiet attention, as if he always knew what needed to be protected. Once I got a bad grade and hid in my room terrified of being scolded. But that evening, Dad knocked on the door, placed a new pencil on my desk, and said nothing. I understood. It was his way of saying start again. It's okay, my father never took credit. He never listed the things he had done, but all of us remembered. Because those silent sacrifices, when repeated day after day, year after year, became a presence as solid as stone. And we, though we never said it aloud, always returned to that presence whenever life felt too shaky. Dad was not the kind of man who stood out in a crowd. He never received an award, never had his name called on a stage. But to me, he was a quiet hero, the kind whose every step, every nail hammered into the roof, every time he gave up the best part of the meal, left behind footprints that time could never erase in the hearts of his children. And then one day, everything did not go as usual. There was no sound of the engine, no familiar footsteps. That morning, for the first time, my father did not go to work. And for a child who had grown up in a world where life never skipped a beat, not even by a minute, that was enough to shake the ground beneath me. I woke up earlier than usual, not because of an alarm clock, but because something felt off in the air. As if the house, which had always pulsed with a steady rhythm, had suddenly missed a beat. There were no clinks of dishes in the kitchen, no radio playing the morning news. What jolted me awake was silence. I walked downstairs. Mom was standing with her back to me, one hand resting on the kettle, the other lightly placed on the back of a chair, as if waiting. Her shoulders slightly curled under her gray sweater. She did not look at me like she usually did. Instead, she kept her gaze fixed toward the living room where the early morning light had not yet reached. My father was sitting there. No coat, no shoes, just a light blue sweater, his hair messy, uncombed, and a blanket laid gently across his knees. His usual cup of coffee was still in his hand, but his fingers were not as steady as they used to be. They trembled slightly, and with each cough, the cup tilted in his grip. My father rarely got sick. I cannot even recall the last time he took a day off. Even during snowstorms, when schools closed and cars would not start, somehow he always managed to leave the house. So seeing him there, sunken eyes, heavy breath, felt like watching the strongest wall in our home begin to crack. Mom said it was just the flu, not serious, just needed rest. But when I stepped closer and looked into Dad's eyes, I saw something I'd never seen before: fatigue. Not the kind from working too hard, but the kind that comes from carrying too much for too long, and finally, the body saying, "That's enough." None of us knew what to do. Tom leaned against the doorframe, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched. He looked confused like the rest of us. Billy clung to his stuffed bear, eyes wide occasionally, tugging my sleeve and whispering, "What's wrong with Dad?" I had no answer. I just kept looking at Dad, then at the coffee cup in his hand, the same one that was always empty by this hour, now barely touched. That entire day, we spoke less than usual. No one turned on the television. No one fought over the radio. The whole house went quiet, as if it were holding its breath with him. Mom made lemon water, cooked rice. Porridge set the medicine on the table, then sat beside him, quietly knitting. No small talk, no fuss. She just stayed there as if her presence alone could say, "I'm here. You're not alone." By noon, sunlight slipped through the window and stretched his shadow longer than I'd ever seen it. I sat on the stairs, watching him, making sure he would not notice. He was reading the newspaper, or pretending to. His hands held it steady, but his eyes did not move with the lines. just sat there for a long time, as if just sitting still was harder than driving a truck to work. That evening, Mom softly said he'll be all right, but her voice did not sound as certain as it used to. Billy placed his favorite pillow, the one he used for his afternoon naps, on Dad's chair, then ran off without turning back. Tom dragged an old oil heater from the shed, plugged it in next to the couch, then quietly disappeared into his room. And me? I sat there beside my father. I said nothing, asked nothing, did nothing. I just sat so he would know I was there. In that moment, I did not need to say a word. I only needed him to know that for the first time he had to stay home. The man who never missed a day, the one who moved without pause, there was still a little boy quietly sitting beside him. No noise, no questions, just stillness. Enough for him to feel that his presence was more than enough. That night I could not sleep. I listened to the dry coughs echoing faintly from the living room, soft, steady like the weakened heartbeat of the house. In the dark, I pictured my father, under the dim yellow light, his face thinner, eyes darker, hands still gripping that old newspaper, as if waiting for the morning headlines to bring back the rhythm that had been broken today. He did not ask for anything. He did not reach for his coffee. He just sat still. And somehow that meant more than anything. By early morning, the kitchen lights were glowing again. The radio played the same news bulletin, like nothing had changed. Dad, his hair neatly combed still, in the same blue sweater, stood by the window, coffee cup in hand. But his eyes, they were different, softer, clearer, as if to say the weariness had been seen, understood, and overcome through the quiet strength of simply being seen. He looked at me, nodded once, and stepped out the door. The engine came to life. Tires crunched on gravel. His silhouette faded around the bend. Everything looked the same again, but in my heart something had changed. I no longer saw an invincible man standing on a rooftop. I saw a human being, simple, vulnerable, but still, choosing to stand armed with only a cup of coffee and one quiet nod. Now, when I look back on that night, I understand what made my father the pillar of our home was not his strength or his calloused hands ready to fix anything. It was his ability to sit still when he could not move forward, his ability to rise again even when weary, and the way he wrapped his whole family inside the embrace of silent, wordless love. That is how a father loves, not with speeches or grand displays, but through quiet mornings when no one sees him, sleepless nights, silent nods, the hum of a truck pulling away slowly. And somehow, that is enough. Enough to stir something in your heart and remind you that strength is not about never falling, but about choosing to rise again so no one else has to stumble. Time moves forward like a spinning wheel, and one day Tom packed his duffel bag and boarded a bus heading east to join the military. Billy chose another path, simpler. He went to learn refrigeration repair at a small vocational school a few hours away. Each of my brothers left in their own way, and once again I was the one who stayed behind, holding on to the old things they carried with them in their footsteps and their silent gazes. Tom left on a morning in May. Sunlight slanted through the kitchen window as he signed his enlistment papers. There were no goodbyes, just a long glance into the convex mirror by the door, where I saw his reflection stretch across the wall like a quiet promise. I'll be back. The polished green duffel hung heavy on his back. Tom stepped out the wooden door, his steps light but sure, just like Dad when he touched the steering wheel. The bus rolled away gently like a wish for peace. Tom waved once, then faded into a figure down the sun-warmed country road. I stood there silent, swallowing a sadness that tasted like growing up. Each of Tom's letters, even short ones with crooked handwriting, struck deep. He wrote from the wild corners of America, where mountains and dust merged into one. He told stories about his squad mates, the scent of gunpowder, and how the moon lit up the cracked soil along the border. But no matter how far he went, his letters always ended the same way. Hope everything's still standing strong back home. One summer afternoon, Billy climbed into a delivery truck with his small tool kit slung over his shoulder. He was not even old enough to drink legally, but he already knew how to fix a ceiling fan or replace a valve. That skinny little boy was growing fast like a young sapling, pushing past the shadows of childhood. Billy was not dramatic. He simply touched the doorknob once before leaving. Mom watched from the porch, smiling with tears on her cheeks. Tom held up 2 fingers in a stay steady sign. I looked at the stuffed bear Billy used to carry every morning. It still lay in the living room, perfectly still, like proof that he had grown up. Billy's letters spoke of breadcrumbs between classes, the smell of welding masks and greasy uniforms. He described how cold the tools felt in his hands and how proud he was after fixing his first air conditioner. He even tried to mail home a piece of Mom's old cake, but by the time it arrived, it was crumbled and smashed. I touched those crumbs and tasted something sweet from the past. In the years that followed, I was the only one still standing on the porch, each morning, the place where time had once carved the footsteps of Dad, of Tom, of Billy, and of me. Each morning I would gently push open the door. The breeze touched my hand, and in the half-light of dawn, I could still see them, not with my eyes but with memory. Quiet echoes, like the sound of a door softly closing, an engine rumbling far away, or sometimes the sigh of someone just beginning to leave. I never needed to write anything down. Every time someone left, it was like a pencil mark pressed into memory, not bold, not sharp, but permanent. My father was the first to go each morning quietly on time. Then Tom, then Billy. Each with a journey of their own. Each leaving behind a silhouette across the fence, a trail of dust and a footstep that echoed inside my heart. None of them ever promised to return, but somehow they are always here, through a glance, a breath, a moment left unspoken. Now the porch is coated with a fine layer of dust. The afternoon sun slides across the old wooden planks. The same radio Mom once turned on every morning still sits there, long broken, yet somehow I still hear something. In the wind, a bit of classical music, a summer news bulletin, or Dad's gravelly voice asking Mom to make the coffee just a little stronger. Sounds I thought were gone. Now the only companions each morning, I sit here alone. Tom came home just once, but it felt like the world held its breath when he did. He stood at the front gate for a long time, not saying a word, as if silently measuring the weight of the years that had slipped by since he last walked through it. The way he looked around, taking in the worn fence, the porch with its flaking paint, the trees now taller than when he left it, was like watching someone trace the lines of an old photograph with their eyes. And when he finally stepped inside, he paused for a moment, then said the only thing he needed to say. "Everything's still okay here. I've been gone a while." I simply nodded without a word. No need for more. In that moment, I watched his eyes soften, not from sadness, but from the deep relief of a man who had faced storms, who had marched through dust, and distance and had finally come home to the familiar creak of the floorboards under his boots. A soldier in his own way, who now knew that this place, this porch, this roof, was still turning gently on the axis called family. And then there was Billy, that little boy, who once trailed behind me everywhere, who once carried a stuffed bear tighter than anything else he owned. He came back 2 years later, holding in both hands an old ceiling fan, the very first thing he ever repaired on his own. Back when he was still in trade school, his hands smaller but full of determination. It was rusty-dusty and long past its use. But to Billy it was gold. When he gently placed it on the kitchen table, his eyes lit up like he was a child again, and he said with a quiet pride, "I'm keeping this smell of oil forever. It reminds me of Dad." I nodded again. No speeches, no sentiment spilled out loud, just silence, the kind that speaks volumes. Because I understood. I understood every unspoken feeling in his voice, every memory hidden in the grease and bolts of that old fan. We had all learned that same language, the one Dad spoke best, where love was action and silence was full of meaning. Now I am old. My hair has long lost the color of youth. My hands, once quick and certain, now tremble slightly when I reach for the coffee cup. I can no longer move with the ease I once had when I used to run to open the gate for Billy or help Mom hang the laundry in the early light. But every single morning, I still sit here on this porch that has weathered everything, with me sipping hot coffee and staring down that same long red dirt road that winds its way out of town like a slow unfinished sentence. And in the soft earth, I still see the tire marks Dad's from years ago, Tom's when he left for the Army, Billy's the day he packed up for trade school. Each set of tracks from a different time, each tied to a different dream, each a reason to leave. And then there are mine, fainter, lighter, quieter, but they are still here. The footprints of the one who stayed, the one who held on to the stories, the one who kept the fire burning and the porch light on just in case anyone ever needed to find their way back home. I stayed, not because I could not leave, but because someone had to keep the small flame alive. The flame of memory of the breakfast Mom used to make, of the old radio's hum, of the warmth from a weathered wooden chair. Time moves in circles. Everyone eventually gets on the bus and goes maybe to school, to the Army, to a new life. But there is always someone who stays, not to stop them, but so they will know the way back home. I think about that every time I look at the old photograph edges frayed from time. A photo of the three of us standing on the porch, squinting into the sunlight, but standing close together. That was how we greeted the morning. That was how we loved one another, not through words, but through presence. And me, I'm still here, like the old porch, like that yellowed photograph, like a storyteller who does not need many words. And then when everything has passed, the mornings, the quiet goodbyes, the letters filled with longing, and the echoes of footsteps fading away, I return and sit down on the old wooden chair by the porch. There, in that simple act of sitting, I discovered a lesson no one had ever spoken out loud, a lesson that had been waiting there all along, written not in words, but in the wood itself. Now, when I return to the old porch, the wooden chair is still there, a silent witness to every morning I once stood barefoot and small, watching my father's figure fade around the bend. The wood is worn thin at the armrests, where the three of us used to rest our hands, trembling slightly as the truck pulled away and the morning dust rose behind it. I reach down, feel the rough wood and the old dust, and my heart sinks heavy with memories of a time so simple yet so strong, so quiet, but unshakable. My eyes drift to the small red dirt road stretching out before me. The afternoon sun stretches the shadow of the chair across the ground, drawing a thin, weathered line like an arrow pointing back toward the past, toward the childhood mornings that shaped me. That place where broken pieces of time still seem to exist, echoes inside me like the slow, patient rhythm of remembered days, a rhythm that still beats beneath the surface of my life. Even now, I sit down feeling the coolness of the old wood seeping into my skin, its aged grain pulsing gently beneath my hands like a quiet heartbeat. The chair creaks just a little familiar and comforting, and suddenly it feels like time is folding in on itself. Everything around me seems to rewind, not with urgency, but with a soft unraveling. I see that morning again, the one that never left me. None of us boys said a word. We just stood there frozen in the golden light of dawn, watching our father, silent as ever, drive off to work in that old truck. No goodbyes, no last looks, no waving hands. Just a shared stillness, and that moment wrapped in silence carved itself deeper into my heart than any photograph ever could, deeper than any letter ever written. I close my eyes and let the wind brush against my face. It moves gently like breath, and I imagine it whispering into my ear. Understanding comes in silence, and in that moment I truly understand. The greatest lessons, the ones that stay with you, do not come wrapped in words or speeches or instructions. They come in quiet gestures, in the way someone you love shows up every day, stands firm, and simply keeps going. They come from a wooden chair that has never left its place, one that still remembers the weight of little legs, dangling the soft thud of muddy shoes, the return of someone who never needed to knock. Now sitting here, I can hear the present moment breathing all around me. Off in the distance, there is the soft rumble of a bus gliding down the highway. Leaves shuffle under someone's slow footsteps just beyond the fence, and inside the house, the faint hum of classical music drifts from the old radio like a ribbon tying the past to the present. This small town, even after all these years, still lives in the quiet, dignified rhythm of peace. It has not rushed to catch up with the world. It still wakes up, gently stretches with the light, and settles into the arms of silence without fear. I remember how Mom used to turn on the radio every single morning, not to fill the room with sound, not to cover up the silence, but to remind us that we were still here, that the world was still turning, that in a house filled with daily routines and humble meals, there was still purpose, still belonging, and above all, still love, simple, unspoken love that reached into everything we did without ever having to be announced. I remember the times Tom laughed and said, "It's all right, the house will still be here." I remember Billy fixing the ceiling fan for Dad, his eyes shining with a pride far bigger than the room. All those moments, though never spoken out loud, became carvings on my heart, reminders that love is often given through actions, through the creak of a door opening, the twist of a radio knob, the presence of a chair on an old porch, waiting faithfully for its people to return. I lift my head, look straight down the dirt road, and I realize I know how to love. I know that in a family, the most sacred thing is not what's spoken, it is what's felt and carried quietly inside. I do not need a report card of love. I just need a chair, a footprint, and a silent gaze to understand everything that matters. Under the soft glow of dusk, I say quietly to myself, back then no one said a word, but I understood so much just by standing and watching. And from this place where the wooden chair still stands, I promise to hold silence with reverence so that the lessons etched into my heart will never fade. If you have ever had a quiet morning where you stood still watching someone you love leave, or if there is something you never said yet never forgot, feel free to share it in the comments below. Because maybe someone else out there is reliving a memory just like yours. And if these stories have touched a part of your memory, do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you and I, Jack Wilson, can continue this journey back to the old days together. Thank you for listening.